Hello everyone. In today's video, we are going to be looking at another archer build. From now on, every build that I post will be builds that can complete Fatal Bridge as, in the past, I have posted experimental builds that ultimately don't. I will still outline the strengths and weaknesses of every build that I do, talking about how easy they are to assemble and how successfully they can complete Fatal Bridge. Obviously, you do need to take into account that leveling up, and upgrading your equipment, is a big part of improving your stats, so don't worry if your stats don't look like mine, as I'm level 184 in this video. Finally, if you're wondering why the narration sounds different, I'm using a voiceover because in the future, I may have less opportunity to record voiceovers myself, so let me know your opinions on it. Before we start looking at the stats, I would like to talk about the Darkrise Discord, because some experts have decided to create a list of endgame stats needed to complete Fatal Bridge for every class. I'm displaying the Archer one on screen, and I largely agree with it. It's very good as a guide that you can use as a goal for your own character. What I'm going to do is compare my stats to this guide and explain any differences. We'll start with the offensive stats and start with damage. The guide says you should aim for 15k plus damage, and I agree. My character here has just over 15k damage, and with potions this will go up. Haste is at 118%. Haste can be a useful stat because more haste equals more arrows, but I don't think it is something you need to focus on, and the experts who made the guide seem to agree because it is not on the list. Next is armor penetration. Armor pen used to be one of the most important stats that you would continuously try and improve. This is no longer the case, and my character has 66% armor pen. Now the guide says 65 to 70%, so I'm in this range, and with potions this again will go up. Critical rate is at 81%. The guide says 75 to 85%, so I'm in that range. Critical severity is at 437%. The guide says 600%. Now again, with potions and the ferocity rune, your critical severity will go up, so there isn't an issue here either. Now skill recovery is where we see a big difference. My skill recovery is at 10%. The guide says 50%, with reason being that this will allow you to have 6 wolves in battle or poison spam. This is definitely a good tactic, so if you do want high skill recovery, you can go for it, but my build purposely has low skill recovery. This is because I don't use poison attacks, and although I do use wolves, I use them more as a defensive option to bait attacks and to distract enemies. Therefore, I don't need as many of them. My control power is 0, and the guide doesn't even mention it. Now we are moving on to our defensive stats, and we are going to start with health. My health is just over 70k, but the guide says 110k to 120k. Now firstly I will say that my health does increase with foods and potions, but again I believe my health is fine. This is because I'm using a couple of equipments that have damage reduction passive abilities, so my health doesn't need to be too high. My defense is at 78%, which is in line with the guide. My block rate is at 79%, again in line with the guide. Next is block severity. Mine is at 71%, while the guide only says 50%. My high block severity is another reason why my overall health is so low. Control resistance is at 2%, with the guide not even mentioning it. Finally, we are going to look at the special stats, and again, there are some differences between my build and the guide. My mana is at 100 and the guide says 200 to 300. Now if you remember, earlier I said I don't use poison or constantly use wolves. As a result, my mana usage is lower. I do believe more mana is useful, and this can ultimately be increased by leveling up and using the passive skill tree. My mana regen is also lower than the guide for the same reason. Mobility isn't important for Fatal Bridge. Now we are going to be looking at how I achieved these stats, and so it's time to look at our equipment. Now the first thing you'll notice is that I'm using a lot of normal legendary items. All the normal legendary equipment shown here was crafted with the goal of getting the stats that I want. Looking at all 10 items, 5 have defensive stats and 5 have offensive stats, which shows the balance in this build. Like I said earlier, this build has a couple of items which have damage reduction passives. These items are Negation and the Protector's Ring. There are no set bonuses in this build. In terms of gems, I'm using 12 armor pen gems and 18 damage gems. Despite not using poison attacks, I am using the Viper Ring. This is only because I don't have another offensive ring, and crafting rings is really hard. Finally, in terms of runes, I'm using the Ferocity rune to increase my critical severity and the Immunity rune. The guide says to use the Magic Protection rune, but I prefer the Immunity rune, which activates when you need it most. Next, we are going to look at my passive skill tree. As you can see here, it's really spread out, capturing most of the passive skills and class paths. When I level up, I will go up and collect more mana, as this would improve my character a lot. Finally, we are going to look at my active skills. I'm using Base Shot, Barrage, Multi-Shot, Heal Wave, and Wolf's Call. Now we are going to talk about strengths and weaknesses of this build. While gameplay of this build completing Fatal Bridge plays in the background with potions, foods, and passives all active. In terms of strengths, this build is very balanced. The best builds tend to be good in multiple stats, and that's what this build does. This build also used very little unique items and sets, which means if you're struggling to find unique legendary items, this might be something you want to try. And of course, this completes Fatal Bridge, which is what you want. In terms of disadvantages, although there's little unique items, Negation and the Protector's Ring are really important for this build, as they allow for lower overall health, so you would need these two items. The non-unique items are all crafted, and crafting items takes a really long time and a lot of grinding if you plan to only use specific stats per item. If you don't plan effectively and use any item with any yellow stat, you'll quickly realize your build is no longer balanced.